Well, hello and welcome to today's Sagan National Colloquium talk. This year's colloquium, as you probably know since you have sheets and flyers, but is titled Bite, Examining the Mutually Transformative Relationship Between People and Food, and we're going to get another great angle on that particular theme with today's event. As you may know, the series actually continues until November 14th, so be sure to check the website that's on the handout that you have and the schedule for all the wonderful speakers and events that we have as part of this series. My name is Chris Fink, and I'm a faculty member here at OWU in the Department of Health and Human Kinetics, and I'm also the director of the colloquium this year, and really excited about today's speaker, Dr. Sinan Koont. Dr. Koont is an associate professor of economics at Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And his teaching interests include macroeconomics, development economics, econometrics, mathematical economics, and comparative economic systems. And his current research interest is urban agriculture in Cuba, which will become very obvious here in just a few minutes as he starts to speak. He earned his PhD in economics from UMass in 1987, and that's obviously informed what he'll be speaking about today, as well as his interest in Cuba. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Koont to our campus.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, and also for this wonderful invitation to address you on an issue that I consider very important. So it's always a pleasure for me to get an opportunity to talk about it. And I am going to, first of all, give you a brief introduction. Oh, well, no. I'm not supposed to be using that microphone. And they don't work together at the same time, so.
Use us for a moment here while we figure this out. It's on, yeah.
Keep on talking, okay. Here. Is it loud enough in the back? Can you talk? Can you hear? I'm sure you can talk. Okay, very good. Very good. That's all right. All right, I'm going to start my talk, first of all, by, as the title of the talk indicates, if I can find my laser pointer here. Says, Cuba embraces agroecology. So I have to give you some idea about what agroecology means, obviously, before you start wondering what this thing is that Cuba is embracing. But I am also then going to talk about how and why, first of all, and how they did this. And then, so I'm going to talk 15, 20 minutes perhaps, giving you the institutional framework, the different paths that Cuba took to arriving where it's at right now over the last 20 years. Then I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation of pictures I took while in my sabbatical in Cuba, which then became the basis of the book, and that's the only time I'm going to plug it. It's called Sustainable Urban Agriculture in Cuba. Okay, that book came out of that sabbatical experience in 2007, essentially. And then, after the PowerPoint is over, I'll talk briefly about the results achieved and where it might be going, et cetera. And then we'll go into the question and answer period. And maybe you can talk a little bit about where Cuba's agricultural effort in this area is heading, in the future. Okay, so with that introduction, I'm going to proceed with the sort of a prepared part of the talk before I turn to the PowerPoint. But I should bring this down if I can. The terms I'm going to be using. So some of these words I'm going to be using in my presentation, and I don't want them to just wash over you and you don't understand anything about them, so I'll point them out to you again as we go through. Okay. So one of the most interesting and important developments in Cuba in the last 2 decades has occurred in its food production and distribution systems. The results of this development include one of the world's shortest producer-to-consumer chains in fresh produce and the general introduction of agroecological production technologies throughout the island. Now, agroecology is a field of study that came into being as a counterpoint to industrialism in agriculture. By industrialism, I mean heavy use of machinery and pesticides and fertilizers derived from petroleum. It's an industrial, almost factory-like production in agriculture. And agroecology takes a completely different tack from that to agricultural production. So it attempts to apply ecological theory to plant animal communities managed by humans to produce food, fuel, and fiber. The approach is holistic and pays full attention to environmental concerns and to the human participants in their political, economic, social, and cultural settings. The management techniques it advances include the elimination of the use of agrochemicals to reduce toxicity, the enhancement of biodiversity, and the resulting increased natural pest resistance, the practice of intercropping and crop rotation, improvements in the quality of soils by increasing organic materials and biological activity in the soils being cultivated. The stress is on making agroecosystems more productive with fewer external inputs, ideally in a self-sustaining manner, and fewer damaging environmental and social outcomes. So agroecological practice then attempts to minimize the use of fossil fuels, such as petroleum, and their derivatives, such as chemical pesticides and fertilizers, in production or in transportation. So why did Cuba embrace agroecology in the early 1990s? It sounds like a tough question to answer, but I'd like to suggest that as it turns out, Cuba had little choice in the matter. If you might remember the early 90s, something very important happened in Cuba's life, which was what? I guess I don't want to elicit response from the audience right now, but in a classroom, I would now elicit that response, but I won't. I'll go. Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet Union and Comecon, the Eastern European Socialist bloc of nations with which Cuba was in close economic relations, collapsed essentially. Soviet Union's collapse meant the cutoff of all petroleum supplies, machinery, spare parts, pesticides and fertilizers based on petroleum, which were all imported into Cuba for its fairly industrial agricultural system that they had developed. So almost overnight, Cuba had to adopt technologies in production and distribution of foodstuffs that minimize its use of imported inputs. Well, an alternative that almost naturally suggested itself was urban agriculture. The production of foodstuffs in and near cities. In urban agriculture, the proximity of large population concentrations precluded the general use of toxic pesticides or polluting fertilizers, even if they had been available, which they weren't. And the existing demand by local consumers minimized the need for fuel and trucks to transport the food to distant customers. So now we can see why they wanted to do it, at least, you know. But, however, having to do something and actually doing it are two sometimes quite different things. In its forced turn to agroecology, Cuba faced various formidable challenges. Finding appropriate spaces in and near cities to be used for food production, learning about, generating, and disseminating new agroecological technologies, recruiting, training, and retaining urban agricultural workers stemming from the city populations, and thus, for the most part, agricultural novices. And doing all this in the midst of the worst economic crisis in the history of the Cuban Revolution, precipitated by the collapse of the Soviet Union. Because that collapse and the economic connections Cuba had with the Soviet Union meant not just the death knell to agriculture, but also a death knell to its industry and to its transportation. And it was by far the most critical period in the Cuban Revolution's history when it happened, and it caused a big economic crisis on the island. Now, in this effort of turning to agroecology, Cuba could count on a strong central government capable of making society-wide decisions to implement new policies and create new institutions. There are also some historical legacies of 30 years of revolutionary development that would stand Cuba in good stead in confronting the challenges it faced. These legacies included the universally and well-educated population, very capable of learning and adapting further, and two, a strong and coherent gender, work, and territorially based social organization comprising labor unions, the Federation of Cuban Women, student organizations, neighborhood committees, and small farmers associations. These two factors certainly facilitated the large-scale changes in food production technologies and institutions by making rapid policy innovation and implementation possible. The real enablers, however, of the massive introduction of urban agriculture in Cuba's cities were similarly massive efforts in the organization of guidance and administration through the Ministry of Agriculture, in scientific research and technological development in agroecology at universities and specialized governmental research centers, in creating incentives, both material and moral, to attract and retain a workforce, in constructing support networks for generating and disseminating agroecological technologies, in building supply networks for needed inputs for agroecological production, such as compost and worm humus and seeds and biological pest control materials. In education in agroecology in primary schools, agricultural technical schools at the secondary level, and in universities. In on-the-job training programs in production units. So all this had to come into place and back this effort for it to be successful, I think. One new technology that was introduced is called the Organa Pony. And I think I can, but I don't know where I put my laser pointer. Oh, here it is. Okay, here's agroecology we've been talking about. Here's Organa Pony technology. You might see a slight relation there to the word hydroponic, which is more commonly known. That refers to production of vegetables in liquid substratum, essentially, without using soil. Well, Organa Pony was a takeoff from that, but referred to production of vegetables in substrata, artificially created substrata that weren't liquid, so solid, compost and worm humus and things like this, mixture that were put into canteros or beds in which to grow the vegetables. Anyway, it was called Organa Pony. This had been developed by the armed forces of Cuba as early as 1980s, with the goal of being able to feed the troops in case access to fossil fuels was cut off for whatever reason. As you know, the governments of the United States and Cuba have rather hostile attitudes towards each other, and you might know from history that during the October missile crisis in 1962, when the world came to almost a nuclear war over some Soviet missiles that had been installed in Cuba, and ever since that time, the U.S. has maintained an economic embargo, and the possible potential threat of cutting off Cuba from the outside world, essentially. So in the armed forces of Cuba, there was a serious concern about how do we feed the troops if we cannot get access to fossil fuels or machinery. So this technology utilizes batteries of, let's say, 20 or 30, 1 meter by 30 meters, so pretty big, 1 yard by 30 yard beds, raised beds, these raised beds are walled. Okay? They use agroecological techniques, only natural fertilizers and pest control. And they are very labor intensive. They use a lot of people. They're manual labor intensive. This was introduced, the research for this was done in the Armed Forces Agricultural Research Institute, essentially. In 1987, the then Defense Minister Raul Castro, who is the current president of Cuba, visited this agricultural research center, liked what he saw, and said, let's do this in the armed forces. That was 4 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So organoponicos started being used near troops' barracks and things like produce vegetables for the troops. In 1991, the first civilian organoponico. Now the crisis has hit. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The first civilian organoponico was installed in the Miramar district of the city of Havana. And you'll see a picture of it later on when I show the slides. And by the end of 1993, that's almost 20 years ago, both the Minister of Agriculture and the provincial government of the city of Havana were strongly supporting extension efforts to spread the new technology throughout the city. The first organizational push at the national level came in May 1994 at the first national plenary of organoponicos in the city of Santa Clara. And at this meeting, initial steps were taken that would eventually, in 1997, lead to the formal organization of the Grupo Nacional de Agricultura Urbana. Do I have that up there yet? Okay. I'm going to refer to this as GNAU from here on, GNAU, Grupo Nacional de Agricultura Urbana, because that became the leading guiding organization of urban agriculture in Cuba in general. But in 1997, it's established. Okay. The GNAU was constituted as a leadership body consisting of some 36 members to provide guidance to the burgeoning urban agriculture effort. It was headquartered at INIFAT, a major national agricultural research center located near Havana. Its membership included PhD-level agricultural scientists, specialists from various participating ministries, prominent leaders in agronomic research institutions, etc. So they were sort of a high-level intellectual guidance kind of body for urban agriculture. Once in place as supervisor, in quotes, of all urban agricultural efforts in Cuba, GNAU found itself face-to-face with a complex panorama of new and old economic participants active in this area, using different production modalities and organized into various land tenure or land tenancy structures. The old industrial state farms, which in Cuba, incidentally, were huge. At one point, there were only 250 farms in all of Cuba. And Cuba is a pretty big island. It's not just a little bitty, it's not like Jamaica or even Haiti or something. It's pretty big. It's about 700 kilometers long, 100 kilometers wide. It's got 12 million people. So it's not an insignificant country. And imagine having only 250 farms on that island. That's how many state farms they had. 100,000 hectares, in each state farm that were being worked. Okay. this old industrial state farm system broke down, and it had to be broken up into smaller units that could be worked without all this machinery and fossil fuel use and employing the machinery, etc. In 1993, as part of the process of dismantling this huge and now dysfunctional state farms, a law was adopted creating a new institution and land tenure, the so-called Unidad Básica de Producción Cooperativa. I have that up there. Right here. UBPC, it's a very common acronym in Cuba now. UBPC, Unidad Básica de Producción Cooperativa. Even those of you who don't know Spanish ought to be able to make out what that means. Basic unit of cooperative production. Okay? This is an institution established for the first time in Cuba in 1993. Okay? These were new cooperative structures in which groups of ex-state workers were brought together in voluntary association to work the land. They received the land from the state in usufruct. I had that right here. Usufruct. I don't know if any of you mean what that means. It receives some usufruct. You get the usufruct of the land. In other words, the state gave the land to the cooperative free of charge. The cooperative received the land, but they did not become owners of it. They only get user rights, essentially. That's where the usufruct comes in. And they did not own the land, so they could not buy and sell the land or anything like that, but they could employ it, and all the product they produced belonged to them, to the cooperative. And they also owned all their implements and machinery and things like that. So it was a cooperative that was based on land given by the state but held in usufruct. Okay. UBPCs were formed in general on lands previously belonging to state farms, as they were broken up into smaller pieces, but also on suitable vacant urban areas that could be used for agricultural production, and cooperatives could be situated on them. Okay. Individuals were also eligible to apply for usufruct plots, they're called parcelas, they call them parcels of land, essentially. As an individual, you go to the state and say, I'd like to farm, give me a parcel, I want to grow vegetables. And the state will give some land to you in usufruct. So you could use it, and all the produce you produce was yours, essentially. On these plots, they could produce food for their families, but also for the market, if the plot was big enough. Also, now, these individual usufructors with their small plots of land were encouraged to seek membership in already existing or newly created cooperative structures called Cooperativas de Créditos y Servicios, CCS, the Cooperativas de Créditos y Servicios. These are actually should be quite common as a concept in the United States too, credit and service cooperatives. This is where individual participants join in order to take advantage of size of the group in getting better deals and obtaining credit or services from the outside. Okay, so these CCSs united usufruct farmers, which were newly brought into creation in 1903, with their individual plots of land, with owners of previously existing private farms. And this is a little known fact about Cuba. Although Cuba nationalized most of its agrarian lands after its revolution in 1959, about 15% of the land remained in private peasant hand, essentially. And after the agrarian reforms that nationalized most of the land, these smaller peasant holdings were guaranteed that they would not be touched in any kind of nationalization or anything. To this day, they have maintained their independent private existence, with some limitations. I mean, we can't think of it as our private farms or something because, like, there's no land market, so like you can't buy and sell land or things like that. But they own the land, and they owned all their house, their means of production, and their product was theirs to sell. Mostly to the state through contracts in the early years, certainly. Now they're getting a little more scope. But anyway, the new CCSs combine those kind of people, all-time private farmers, together with these new usufructures to get plots of land and whatnot in a cooperative organization. I'll show some examples of that in my slideshow as well. Okay. All right. Now, joining these mostly new economic actors were over 1 million Cuban households, which, like houses everywhere, had traditionally raised vegetables and planted fruit trees and chickens or whatever in their backyard. I guess you don't plant chickens, but whatever you do with them, raising them. These households now turn to backyard production in a much more serious way. In a manner should be reminiscent to the older ones among you. Actually, not even reminiscent to them, I guess, but at least in the framework of their mindset, should be victory gardens of the United States. In the First and Second World War, a lot of families were told, grow your own vegetables in your backyards. So in a manner reminiscent of the victory gardens of World War II, the urban populations of Cuba sought sustenance in production from their home gardens, essentially. So, from 1993 on then, the urban agricultural landscape in Cuba contained 4 different modalities in the production of vegetables in and near cities. Organa Ponicos, Huertas Intensivas. I don't know if I have that up there. I don't think I do. Okay, Huertas Intensivas. Now you have to know some Spanish to understand what I'm talking about. Huerta Intensiva means intensive gardens. And those were essentially organoponicos, the same idea of raised beds with a substratum made up of worm humus and compost and things like this. Again, 1 meter by 30 meters, ideally. The standard arrangement was that. Arranged in an array of 20, 30 of them next to each other, let's say. The only difference was that they didn't have the walls around the beds. And they were called a different modality because of that. The reason being that the walled structures have yields about 20, 30% higher than the Huertas Intensivas. The containing of the soil or the substratum apparently helps a lot in the maintenance of fertilizers in the bed and stuff like this, no rain runoff or whatever. So beds are quite important. But anyway, they did, that was the second modality, essentially organic ponicos without walls. And then parcelas, these plots people had received in usufruct, and backyards, which in Spanish are patios, backyards, patio, like patio, I guess. And although, as you shall see, the vegetable production has achieved most success in urban agriculture, the scope of this effort is much broader. GNAO has organized urban agriculture into 28 sub-programs, of which vegetables and fresh condiments is about 1. There are 12 sub-programs in crop cultivation, ranging from medicinal plants and dried herbs to fruit trees, to rice production, to so-called semi-protected organoponia. 7 sub-programs in animal raising, ranging from rabbit raising to fish farming to sheep and goat raising. No cattle in the cities or suburban areas even. But, and 9 sub-programs in support areas, ranging from organic fertilizers to agroecological integration, a program called that, to irrigation and drainage in organoponicos, etc. And these programs were not limited to just a few big cities, Havana or something. They were spread pretty uniformly throughout the 15 provinces and 169 counties into which Cuba is subdivided. And GNAO's role is to provide guidance, information, and supervision. It acts as a tireless promoter, inspector, and evaluator of urban agriculture and is an overall control of all urban agricultural activity. The inspections and evaluations take place during tours, they're called corridos, they call them, organized by GNAO on a quarterly basis. So 4 times a year, the leadership goes on this national tour, essentially, visiting places. every single one of the 1,452 consejos populares, I have that here, the Consejo Popular, that's an administrative territorial unit below the county level. It's smaller than a county. There are on the 169 counties, there are 1,452 consejos populares, popular councils they are called. Every single one of them is visited by GNAO each year. Not during each corrido, possibly, because they occur 4 times a year, but all 1,452 are visited each year. During these inspection visits, GNAO experts give presentations on technical aspects of agroecological production, essentially providing extension services. The team also evaluates local production units, classifying them into good, average, and bad categories, following guidelines established for each sub-program. Outstanding units are eventually rewarded with what in Spanish called de referencia status, referable status almost, de referencia status. And not only do these designations act as well-deserved moral recognition and incentive, but units singled out become centers of dissemination and extension of successful practices, receiving visits from other units eager to earn from their experience. Okay. GNAO does all these things, but it does not administer, does not buy output from or sell inputs to producers, or provide logistical support to urban agriculture. For that purpose, the Minister of Agriculture has organized a parallel track. Beginning in 1995, so-called granjas urbanas. Granja urbana, that means an urban farm, essentially. But Granja urbana is an institution, a new institution introduced in 1995, that does all that. That looks at the administrative, executive side of things, buying and selling from producers, marketing things, providing inputs, distributing. They run a set of stores called CTAs. I don't know if I have that. Yeah. This CTA, Consultoria Tienda de Agricultor. These are extension stores where producers can go to buy seeds, biological pest control materials, manure, organic manure, fertilizers, etc. Okay. In short, the granjas urbanas and MINAG-associated administrative structures see to it that the thing that GNAO is trying to achieve and provide supervision for, etc., it actually happens on the ground. It's executed by people. Okay. So, and these granjas urbanas are meant to be profit-making enterprises, essentially, because they buy and sell things. And now, a lot of them started out making losses initially. They weren't making enough money compared to their costs. But by 2006, 135 out of the 196 granjas urbanas were profitable, in fact, in their business venture, essentially, dealing with local producers. Okay, these twin chains of central state oversight, first the supervisory, evaluative, guiding chain of GNAO, and its extensions at the local levels. And second, the administration, supply and distribution chain from MINAG, this is the Minister of Agriculture, to Empresa, to Granja Urbana, constitute the unique organizational structure well suited to the task of overseeing an urban food production system that has as its guiding principle, and I quote this almost directly from one of their brochures, to decentralize as far as possible without losing control, and I want to still maintain central control, kind of, and to centralize, but only to the degree that does not kill local initiative. Okay, so they are trying to work both sides, centralization and decentralization, in a package, essentially. Okay. Now, my own serious involvement with Cuban urban agriculture began with a sabbatical stay in 2007 that eventually led to the publication of my book, as I said, which is called Sustainable Urban Agriculture in Cuba. Last year, it came out December 2011. And I spent a whole sabbatical there, over 3 months, and worked with urban agricultural in urban agricultural research, actually. And now I would like to turn to a PowerPoint presentation, if I can get it. Well, let's see what I do. Let's first get rid of this, and then I will. Oh, maybe I have it already here. I hope I put it up. Okay. Oops. Not okay. All right. So now I want to do a slideshow. And I want to start from the first slide. Okay. First, I want to show you a map of Cuba and Italy, where I went, the kind of place. I was located in Havana at the University of Havana, and I studied urban agriculture in Havana, obviously. But also with the Grupo GNAO's support, I was able to do work in the Matanzas province, which is to the east of Havana, and Pinar del Rio, to the west of Havana. And these were all done with the help of the organized authorities, essentially. But I also, just on my own, went to Santiago de Cuba one weekend by taking the bus there, and then looked at the urban agricultural situation there. So I have some pictures from there. So this should give you an idea that urban agriculture doesn't happen just in Havana or something. Okay. Now, okay, so that's this slide. Okay. This is in Havana. This is a cooperative. Do you see an acronym which I talked about? The very first thing on the sign says what? UBPC. That's Unidad Básica de Producción Cooperativa. Basic Unit of Cooperative Production. Okay. Alamar is a district in Havana. This cooperative farms about 24 acres. Now, in 2012, it has 170 members. Should give you an idea about the labor intensiveness of this effort. Because can you imagine a farm in Ohio that in 24 acres employs 170 people? Even one person is probably too much for 24 acres. 170, and they all make fairly good living at what they do, producing vegetables. For various reasons. We can go into it later on, perhaps. But, so it says, Organa Alamar, seedlings of high quality, grafted fruit things, fresh vegetables. So they're advertising themselves as to what they do in this cooperative, essentially. And now, what would you call these, for instance, of the various names I introduced? Anybody brave enough to blurt it out? It wasn't even on the list, the one place I hadn't included. They had organopónicos, huertas intensivas, parcelas, and patios as the 4 modalities. Which is this? You think? Huh? No, a field, but they are raised beds, many of them together. They look almost like an organopónico, but they don't have the walls. So that makes this a huerta intensiva, intensive garden, essentially. Okay. This is from that cooperative. This is where they produce their seedlings, because everything is done by transplantation. They don't actually plant seeds in the beds themselves to grow the vegetables. They first produce seedlings in a controlled fashion like this, and they transplant the seedlings into the beds. We can skip this. Here are some workers planting seedlings on these raised beds. Here is some work being done, probably either fertilizer or pesticide, I don't know. But it's all organic. There is no chemical pesticides or fertilizers. And you can see what you see in the background there. You know, this area, these are apartment buildings right across the street. Yeah. So this is a real urban setting, essentially. And here's their small industrial production. They make tomato sauce from excess tomatoes that they've produced. This was in 2007. I also visited them this year in 2012. They have really improved this industrial setting. It's much posher looking. Here's an eggplant that they were growing, and I took that picture because I really like eggplant. They had a whole field of it, and this has been a contribution of urban agriculture. Is Cubans are being introduced to vegetables which they barely knew. I mean, eggplants existed in Cuba, and okra and things like this, but they weren't really in common use. And now urban agriculture is introducing these things into their lives in a big way. Of course, it's hard to do with adults, but if you start with kindergartners and whatnot, introduce them in their diet and their school diet and stuff like that, maybe they'll eventually be able to do it. Okay, here's I can't skip that. And this is their dining area. Here's the price list in their stand. You can see all the different things that are being offered for sale and the prices they are charging for them. These prices are set by them. Nobody sets it for them. I don't know if any of you know Spanish, but you can see, for instance, what is this? Well, I can't even point to it, so how would you know? Oh, what's this? Ajo, garlic. Garlic says 2 pesos a head. 2 peso. A peso by the exchange rate that we have right now is about 4 cents. So 2 pesos would be 8 cents. Sounds like cheap to us, but to a Cuban that would be pretty expensive. Why? Because the average monthly salary is about 450 pesos or something. So to grab 2 of them on a head of garlic maybe is not that cheap. You know, it's not that doable. But in any case, you can see all kinds of different things being offered. You know, tomato, here, Swiss chard, acelga. Humus de lombriz, worm hummus they were selling that they produced on the premises, you know, to use as fertilizer, to be used in flower pots in the homes and stuff like that. They were selling in small packages. Zanahoria, carrot, lettuce. You can get a head of lettuce for 3 pesos. Carrot was 2 pesos a pound, etc. Okay. These are stands right next to the production unit. That's what I mean by the shortest producer to consumer chain. You know, these things are harvested in the morning, carried in baskets to the front, to the stands, and people come by and buy the vegetables. So you can eat, either for lunch or dinner, vegetables that were picked that morning, essentially, if you are living in those apartment complexes nearby. Oops, I'm going to go back to this. I do this because this guy now is the leader of the cooperative. His name is Salsines. He's now become world famous because this cooperative has become very... So if you just go on the web and just type in Alamar or Salsines, you'll get a lot of information about him on the web now. He's traveled the world talking about his cooperative. And the other guy is the second in command. His name is Noel, but he's not nearly as famous. You're not going to find him on the internet. Okay. Now, next I move on to a patio, backyard. This is a patio de referencia nacional, selected as a real nice backyard operation at the national level in Havana. This is the guy who runs it. There I am. This is me, and this is him. He's a very famous psychologist and runs the mental health system of the city of Havana. He's a consultant for the Ministry of Health. You'd think he'd have a lot of other things to do than have a backyard garden. But he has a backyard garden that he rescued from a completely barren condition into a flourishing yard, essentially. But on Saturdays, he gathers his own kids and neighborhood kids to give them lessons on environmental stuff and also some sociological stuff, like social stuff, like how to get along with each other and stuff like that. And they also do practical work in the garden. Okay, so that's a sort of community building kind of effort he's engaged in. This is his backyard now. Fruit trees. This is also his backyard. This instantly became the front cover picture of my book, not by my choice. The editors of the University of Florida Press did it. And this is just to impress with his substantial personhood. This I took from television. You can see Hola Havana in the corner here. Hola Havana, Hello Havana, and it's a television program. And he was being interviewed in connection with some sort of mental health matter, and then I just happened to be watching television. I said, what's this? I just visited this guy's backyard, you know, and here he is on national television. But all right. Now, this is a CCS. This is the Credit and Service Cooperative in Havana. They have typically a central, commonly run Organa Pony like this. You can see the raised beds with walled. But this was a parcela, an individual usufruct plot of a member of that credit and services cooperative. They all had their own individual plots, 50 of them in different places. And they also had the central Organa Pony that was run by 6 people as part of the cooperative, but wasn't part of this usufruct structure, essentially. But that's a parcela. Somebody's growing vegetables, obviously not for his family in this case, but for the market. This is another member of that cooperative with plenty of access to water, apparently, because it had a flourishing organiponico kind of setup. You can see his walls are made of, I don't know what they're made of exactly, but they're a lot more modest than the concrete huge walls. But nonetheless, they are contained, so that would count as an organiponico. And right next to him was a banana usufructures growing bananas, but he didn't have access to water, although he was right next to the other guy. The other guy was getting his water from the city water, which the city frowns upon, doesn't want to give water to the farmers from the city water. But he happened to be right next to a polyclinic hospital, and the hospital was allotted a certain amount of water per day, and if they didn't use all of it, they'd give it to him, to use in his agriculture. And then he happened to right next to the hospital. This guy was half a block away. He didn't get any water at all from the hospital. He says, I could grow a lot of boniata and yucca and stuff like that between the banana trees, but can't do it because he doesn't have water. So that's the problem. Okay. That's another TCS, another credit and services cooperative, also in Havana. This was their organiponico, central. I didn't get to see their production units because I went there just by myself, not by invitation. They wouldn't let me in, essentially. I could take pictures from the outside, basically. Now, this is that very first organiponico that was put into Havana in 1991. It's called INRE Uno, INRE One. The very first organiponico of Havana was this. And this is what it looks like. And you can see, again, apartment buildings in the background. This is a block, an empty block, that was noticed from the 4th floor of an office building. And the guy who was running that office said, let's put an organiponico there. And then got agreement of the workers that were working for that establishment. And they've been running this for 20 years now. And you can see it's not just growing just a few vegetables on the side or something. It's a major productive effort. This is the same place, another picture of it. You can see the apartment buildings and whatnot a lot more clearly in the background in this. And this is their stand or sale point. Now, I'm all the way at the other end of Cuba and Santiago. I went there without any kind of approval. I just got on a bus and went there. And I was limited to walking around taking pictures from the outside because nobody would let me in. I found out that if you don't have government approval or an appointment was set up ahead of time through official channels, they won't let you into the production units. They are still very nice about it, and a lot of them talked with me, you know, like I could ask, you know, well, what do you guys do here, and how much stuff do you produce, how many workers do you have? They'd answer questions like that, but they wouldn't let me into the production units themselves, you know, into the farms. Now, that's understandable, I guess, in general, I mean. Anyway, I took this picture because it shows the European cooperation. This sign says European Commission, and then a German NGO had contributed to this Organa Pony in some fashion, and so that was interesting in Santiago. But here's Santiago Organa Pony. You can see the walls are getting sort of funkier as we get away from Havana. And the question is, hey, wall them any way you can, just wall them. And that's another one. And once again, you can see all the apartment buildings right in the background. Okay, this is now Matanzas, the province right to the west of Havana. This is the sail point of Organa Pony El Triangula. And this is their lettuce growing operation with the raised beds. Here we are in a hectare, 2.5 acre size plot belonging to a forestry company, actually, of the state forestry company, but these people had been detailed to grow vegetables, essentially, and they had contracts with all kinds of people to produce vegetables. They were making a very good living. That's one aspect of urban agriculture that a lot of people don't relate to too much. It's turned out to be a pretty lucrative business for the workers. I mean, relatively speaking. The average urban wage in Cuba is about 450 pesos. That would be only about $20 a month. Now, you might say, how could anybody live on $20 a month? Well, it's possible to do it in Cuba for various reasons. For one thing, they don't pay anything for housing or education or health care or utilities to speak of, or half of their food comes with a ration book. They only pay $1 for it, you know. So actually, all the money that they earn gets spent on fresh vegetables, basically. That's what they spend their money on. And 450 is just about enough to get them by for the month, you know. But these guys, the guy here is a leader, urban agriculture leader in the Matanzas region. He was proudly showing me a beet, I think, that was that they just harvested. But this lady was a worker at that place. 4 of them worked 2.5 acres, and they earned about 2,000 pesos a month apiece. With their, I mean, that's almost 4 times the average urban wage. And the state has told them, hey, earn anything you can, provided you do it with your effort, you know, you have to, they sell things by contract. In fact, these people didn't even have a roadside stand or something. They only operated with contracts to other institutions, hospitals, military units, etc. And still, and they don't get huge amounts of money for that, but by being a very productive unit, they were making lots of money through these contracts. Okay, this is another look at that. We're looking at the same 2.5 acres, you know, with the last 3 slides. You can see again the walls are just wooden walls or whatever, but. Okay, now we are in Pinar del Rio to the west of Havana. This guy, in an organiponico, Mango it was called, organiponico, they were raising some pigs. And those things they are eating, the pigs are eating are palm seeds that they harvest from the tops of palms, and that makes a very good feed for the pigs, it turns out. This is one of the few surviving hydroponic production units. They are counted as, they are grandfathered into urban agriculture because they're in urban areas and they're hydroponic, but they are not agroecological because they use use a lot of pesticides and fertilizers, chemically based stuff. This is one of the few units, tomato growing unit, they were trying to keep going. But, this is one of the schools. I talked about the effort they made in schools to generate agroecological knowledge. This is the IPA, it's called, Instituto Politécnico Agropecuaria. That's an Agricultural Polytechnic Institute. 15 to 17-year-olds go here to learn essentially agroecological techniques. And the slogan they have painted on the wall is rotation of crops, association of crops, and intercalentamiento, I think. Yeah. Intercropping, essentially. Yeah. This is their Organa Pony. This school was also a productive unit. They had contracts. They were supplying all kinds of people. It was a productive unit as well as a school. And this is their Organa Pony. Here I mentioned Inafat was the headquarters of GNAU, and I talked about the second in command in GNAU I was in touch with. Well, this is the guy. He's got a PhD, and he's an old man who's in charge of this effort, essentially. And this is me, and this is a University of Havana colleague of mine, who's a sociologist, actually. Okay. This slide I included to show you the breadth of this thing. I also included that in the book, actually. Notice that there are yellow, blue, red, and green dots. They mean different things. Seed farms, centers of organic manure, units of excellence. This is the higher category than their referencia, even real good units. And CREs were, I won't even tell the full name of them in Spanish, but they are essentially biological pest control production units. Okay? And now the next slide should impress you, because this is not in Havana. In fact, this is the eastern end of Cuba, where Santiago is. Santiago is down here somewhere, you know, right? And then Holguin is up here. Baracoa, which is the easternmost point, is there, etc. This is the very eastern tip of, I mean, Havana would be way out here somewhere, 600-700 miles away. And look at all these dots. All these dots, you know, blue and green, and where did I see a yellow one? Here it is. You know, these are all urban agricultural units in existence, and that shows all throughout Cuba, all throughout all the provinces, urban agriculture is a big thing that's going on. Okay. Now this is some marketing. This is in Havana, so this is the typical market you might run across. You can see all kinds of, you know, bananas and tomatoes and whatever. You know, price list. This is the state farm store, which is not very well provisioned. But here's another one that has lots of peppers that day. This is a more typical stand that might belong to a production unit. There are small stands like that. There are 5 of them at Alamar, that first cooperative, right by the side of the production unit. This is a little further away from the central area of the second second cooperative I showed you a picture of. But you can see that the kind of things they offer for sale. Okay. I'm going to stop with this. Let's see, we have about 20 minutes, but I want to first give you an idea of the results of this urban agricultural effort. While especially in vegetables and fresh produce, as I said, the results have been nothing short of spectacular. A 1,000-fold increase in 10 years, both by increasing the amount, the acreage that they tilled or used, and increasing yields in those places by switching technologies and stuff like that. So Cuba is now basically self-sufficient in fresh produce. And as I said, this is not limited to just a few big urban areas. Every single province, 15 of them, every single county, 169 of them, has even bigger than Havana kind of urban agricultural effort. You know. Okay. And there are also more modest but seriously planned and pursued progress in all 28 sub-programs. The distribution of output into public hands for consumption takes place through a number of different channels, the most important being direct sales to the public. 60% of the vegetable production in urban agriculture is sold directly by the production unit to the final consumer at the production unit. So that's what I mean when I say the shortest chain between producer and consumer. Within a day or within 4 hours of the picking of the vegetables, it can be being eaten by somebody, you know, which is, and so about 60% goes that way. But there's also self-consumption from backyard production or gardens at enterprises. There's state and free agro markets scattered throughout the city, and social provisioning for schools, hospitals, and at workplaces. And there can be no doubt that urban agriculture is contributing, how should I say, to a healthier diet for the Cubans. By 2006, the per capita intake of calories had recovered to a level of 350. That's a lot of calories. And as you might expect, as a country in which we live, what's one of our major problems in food consumption? Obesity. Well, obesity is beginning to rear its ugly head in Cuba again, too, now. But not when I first started in 1994, because their per capita calorie intake had dropped to 1,800 or something. A starvation rate, essentially, kept up forever. And they look kind of healthy and robust to me still. But my Cuban friends later said, Sinan, you may have not noticed, but we lost about 10 to 20 pounds on average, you know, while we were living through that period. But they had reserves from, maybe they were obese before, and so they looked good by the time I got there. But it certainly contributes to a healthier diet. Now, there's a caveat that I must mention, because the majority of the food in Cuba has traditionally been imported, and importation still continues to be a major source of consumption. Not in fresh produce anymore, obviously, but in things like rice and beans and powdered milk and some meats. Protein is difficult for them to raise easily on a tropical island in any case, because animal feed is short, like Cuba doesn't produce any grains, tropical regions can't produce grain. So there are difficulties in food. I mean, that dates back centuries. This is not a new phenomenon, okay? So, but at least in fresh produce, a corner has been turned. I mean, they can now, Cuban urban populations can get their hands onto very nice, healthy, organically grown vegetables. And they're not even labeled organic or certified or anything. So if you buy tomatoes in Havana, they'll be organic tomatoes from urban agriculture, basically. There's no other tomato in the market. Okay. Furthermore, the benefits of urban agriculture are not limited just to food production and distribution. One benefit is employment, because one of the results of the crisis was a huge rise in unemployment as industry shut down, agricultural state farms shut down. Well, urban agriculture has meant now, by 2012, about 400,000, that's more than 7% of the civilian workforce of Cuba, has found employment in urban agriculture at nicely paid jobs. You know, they're making good incomes compared to others, and to other urban workers, office workers and stuff like that. And secondly, as one might say, damage. Well, carbon dioxide emissions and the toxic effects of pesticides and all this stuff. In fact, I must leave some room for questions, so I'll cut this short, but I want to tell you one anecdote. In 2006, before he became very ill, the Cuban leader, Fidel Castro, in an interview was asked, so what has Cuba done for the environment recently? You know, you guys are always talking about being environment friendly and conscious of the environment. What have you guys done recently in the environmental area? And Fidel Castro's answer was, with no hesitation and with no other options, said urban agriculture. Urban agriculture is our contribution to the environmental situation, you know, not food production or food, you know, although that was its main purpose, obviously, but it also ended up being the outstanding contribution of Cuba to the environment, you know, to lessening the you know, global warming gases and stuff like that. Okay, lastly, thirdly, community building, you know, because this has meant now in all kinds of neighborhoods, local production of food for local consumption. You know, places that had become garbage dumps have been converted into lush gardens and producing vegetables, etc. And it's also become a place where the neighborhood gets together, you know, in a sense. You know, those high rises, one of the places where they get together is when they go shopping at these stands across the street. So that aspect of it is not to be underestimated either. Okay. Now, I'd like to talk about, maybe you'll do that in the question and answer period. I mean, what lessons can the rest of the world take from this? It's not because some of the things that Cuba had that made this possible are just not available anywhere else. I mean, I am firmly convinced to this day that the high educational level of the population played a big role, because this urban population had to start doing technologically new things and get into a line of activity that was completely new to them, etc., and do it successfully in a very short time. But Cuba has a population where you can simply give a person a pamphlet and say, read this and apply it, and they'll go and do it. You know, not too many populations in this world can do that. You know, can even read the pamphlet, or even if they can read it, understand it properly. Even if they understand it properly, to be able to go and apply it somewhere. You know, these are all very difficult things. But apparently those things are not too difficult in Cuba. You know, 400,000 urban workers have been plugged into this agricultural effort. And just because it's urban agriculture, you should not think it's not a technically demanding field. It's even more demanding, perhaps, than just applying pesticides and chemicals and stuff like that, because you have to manage the crops a lot more intelligently. And you have to know what you're doing. And you have to be abreast of the latest developments in this area. And I mean, just to give you an example, that cooperative I referred to, Alamar first, has 170 members. 50 of them are university graduates or middle school, technical school graduates, focusing on agronomy and agricultural work. So it's technically quite sophisticated work that they are doing. And then the owner of it, Salcines, the famous one, I want urban agriculture to become an urban profession, you know, just like a doctor or a lawyer. And these people are highly educated, technically skilled people whose job is to grow vegetables, you know, and they have to do it in a very technologically sophisticated manner, you know, so to speak. All right. Well, I'm going to stop here, I think, and open the floor to questions. I see I ran about 15 minutes over my allotted time anyway, but I'm willing to entertain any and all questions you might have. Mm-hmm. Well, there wasn't much funding coming from anywhere, actually. I mean, Havana is a large city of 2 million people, but there are still quite a few open spaces, even in the pretty densely populated regions of it. So finding space wasn't that much of a problem. And how they turned to that and started doing it, I mean, the thing that comes to mind is necessity is the mother of invention. That is to say, when you're pushed off a cliff and you're going to get dispersed into tiny little specks in 10 seconds, your mind becomes active and to see if you can do something to avoid it. And I mean, this cooperative I mentioned started with 4 people who started working 4 acres. And just the absolute necessity of having to grow some food for survival. And they didn't start out, and this 1,000-fold increase came over 10 years. It didn't come overnight. So it's I mean, that's a very good question, but it's what kind of support could be given in short order. I think the real response to that is lots of things in Cuba were ready to be able to do something like this. For instance, Cuba already, starting in the 60s and 70s, had built up a lot of agricultural research institutes. There was an agricultural university in the province of Havana. And so they had a lot of skilled scientific personnel and things like this. So they could be switched over to agroecology as the area they should concentrate on and start generating new technologies and new ways of doing things and stuff like that. And I mean, the funding, where it came from the Minister of Agriculture in the state. And they gave essentially free land to people who want to grow food. And the usufruct means you get the land free. That'd be a big handicap, barrier in the United States, for instance. I mean, right now, for instance, Detroit is beginning to show signs of urban agriculture. You know what one of the reasons for that is? Land values have done what in Detroit? Plummeted. So urban agriculturalists can start saying, well, we could make some money with these land values, or whatever. And so that never was an issue in Cuba because the state owns all the land, and when it was necessary to grow food, they could do this, allocate pieces of land to people to start producing food. And by now, I like this cooperative in Alamar, people make good money. They don't make 2,000 pesos like those 4 guys in Matanzas, but they make about 650 or 700 pesos a month, which is way above the urban average income. And the reason for that is I think the food prices, vegetable prices, have remained quite high. They're not cheap compared to incomes. But the real explainer there is that the Cuban population essentially spends its money on nothing but fresh vegetables. They don't have anything else to spend it on, from housing to ridiculously cheap utilities and all state subsidized and stuff like that, health care. So they could either think about buying a television or something, but that's astronomical in price. You're never going to get there. They can't buy a television, essentially. It's thousands and thousands of pesos worth. So you get only 400 pesos a month. You just spend it all on fresh food. And most Cubans I know have television in their houses. They get them somehow. I don't know how they get them exactly. They don't buy them from the peso stores. Like you have to pay thousands and thousands of pesos to get one, because nobody has that kind of money. But anyway, yeah. So that's my possible response to that. Any other questions of any type? Any? Yes. Well, okay. First, let me get this person. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
In the next 10 years, where do you see the going in Cuba?
That's a very good question, and then it could get me off on an hour-long talk, because and this is something I intend to pursue in my research, actually. I have a sabbatical next semester. I hope to go back to Cuba, although it's not certain yet. But they discovered that although they designated all the areas around the cities as urban, within 10 miles or something, you couldn't do suburban agriculture the same way you can do this cooperative agriculture with 170 people on 24 acres and your customers right next door. Those conditions don't exist in the suburban areas. The workforce isn't there. I mean, typically in the suburban area, what you're going to have is a farm, a 40-acre farm with a family living on it with 40, 50 acres and 4 or 5 people. And that's what you're going to have to work that land with. How are you going to do it without machinery or tractors and things like that? That was one question. And the second question was, once you produce stuff at that farm, how are you going to sell it to people? You're living out in the middle of the boondocks, and who's going to come to you to buy your stuff? So the Cuban response to that, once they realized this was a problem, because they had said these areas are urban, but nobody was successfully farming them, you know? So they said, we got to do something different. So they've created a whole new program called Agricultura Suburbana, suburban agriculture, the aim of which is a lot more far-reaching. They intend to make all the counties self-sufficient in food in the future, you know, starting from now. But every county is supposed to come up with a project that's how to get to self-sufficiency, starting from where we are now. And those two problems initially that I mentioned are solved by, believe it or not, it's going to sound anachronistic and maybe it doesn't make sense kind of thing. They are going back to animal traction, oxen and teams of oxen. Now that shouldn't get your mind immediately back to 17th century or something, because the oxen are going to produce the traction, the animal power, but they're going to be plugged into a modern industrial, technologically sophisticated mechanism for growing food. So they are not stepping back a couple of centuries, but they are saying, we're going to grow food agroecologically. We're not going to use fossil fuels if we can help it. And similar with distribution, they have a different kind of solution, et cetera. So I'm saying this agroecological push in food production in Cuba is now headed towards sufficiency, self-sufficiency, county by county, and while sticking to agroecological technologies. And it's a tall order. I know that's the first time it's been put on the table, even anywhere in the Caribbean, that this could be done or should be done. But the Cubans feel like they have to become self-sufficient. They've got the land and the possibility of being able to do it. And they have a lot of challenges. And in some areas, it may take them half a century or more to get there. But this is the new path they're on. So it's going to be an interesting process, probably beyond my lifetime, to start to keep considering what they are doing and how they are doing, et cetera. So the vegetable production reached about 4 million tons already in like 2004 or something like that, and it's pretty much plateaued at that level. I mean, last year I asked Compagnoni, so how's production going? So his response was, se mantiene. It's maintaining itself, about 4 million. Well, this is what you'd expect, of course. You're not going to get exponential growth forever. And they are producing enough vegetables now for the needs of the cities and the urban population. So I don't expect a whole lot more happening in that area. But this generalized suburban thrust is going to continue and could produce some interesting results. We'll have to see. I mean, in 2010, I actually visited some suburban agriculture places south of Havana. And they were mostly usufructure farms, individuals who had volunteered. I want to farm, and can give me a 40-acre farm, land, to start producing. And they are doing it. Yeah, what was the question in the back?
My question was that on the different plots of land you described here, the people that are working on those Are those people all there, are they working on that land as a cooperative? Or are there also examples of wage laborers working in these urban gardens? And if there are wage laborers, how does that play itself out within student societies that create more cleavages between student societies?
Yeah. There is now, in the cooperatives and whatnot, there is no principle of wage labor. They employ some of it, but only with a sort of a 3 to 6 month apprenticeship period. In other words, if they need extra manpower, they'll hire somebody as a worker, but with the expectation that within 3 to 6 months, they're going to become members of the cooperative. So there's no long-term idea of cooperatives, for instance, hiring permanent workers, wage workers. And only a very small fraction of the 170 people belong to that category. And they're in transition to become cooperative members. It's a sort of a mutual fit idea, I guess. That is to say, some of these people may also decide to leave the cooperative. You know, they don't want to become urban agriculturalists after having tried it for 3 months. But the idea is, anybody who wants to work in the cooperative will become a member. And the patios and the parcelas are individual operations anyway. You know, they are backyards, family work. There's no employment there. It's the organipónicos and huertas intensivas that are in question. And the CCSs, which are not UBPCs, which combine 50 or 70 individual farmers, usufructures, into a cooperative essentially. But they have a central area where they have an organopónico. They produce in the central area. Now, in those central areas are worked with at least partially with hired labor. I mean, there'll be 7 people assigned to them, let's say. Of those, only 3 may be co-op members. The other 4 are hired workers for the central area. But the usufructures themselves with their parcelas are on their own. They're by themselves. They do it all by themselves. You know, single person. The plots aren't so big that one person can't handle it, you know. But in the future, who knows what's going to happen? Because Cuba is, through economic reforms, is expanding self-employment and small, I don't want to call them businesses exactly, but possibilities are beginning to appear where somebody might say, I am self-employed, I'm doing something, I see that I need help to be able to carry forward, and I'm going to have to hire somebody. I think they're going to allow some hiring on some small scale. But right now, there's not much talk about hiring people for wage labor. Instantly, I mean, in fact, what's happening is there's a big push, next big push that's coming is in industrial co-ops. You know, create cooperatives in industrial work, not just agriculture. And like this colleague of mine from the University of Havana actually instituted a master's degree program in urban industrial cooperativism. And they are trying to create more cooperatives in the cities in industrial work as well. But I'm sure there's going to be some mixture of hired labor in there, I suspect, either by mutual desire or because when push comes to shove, they hire somebody, I guess. You know. And I don't think the laws forbid it exactly. But I think they are limited in number. You can't just hire. You can't always start the factory and start hiring 100 people or something. It's more like very small scale operations. And I don't know the limits of the number of employees an enterprise can have, for instance. But in agricultural co-ops, the principle is everybody becomes a co-op member after some apprenticeship, mutual adjustment period. And the cooperatives retain the right to kick people out, because the assembly that runs them, which is made up of all the co-op members, can kick members out for not doing the appropriate work or not fitting in or whatever, you know. But doesn't happen too often, I think, because they've been in a growth period now, of course, because like this South Sinai's co-op went from 4 people to 170 in 15 years. So it's more like, their concern is more like how do we retain the co-op members? Because some people may decide this is not, they're not going to get up at 7:30 in the morning or whatever. So that's a problem, retention workers. One way they took care of it in that co-op was introduce the concept of capital of labor, which is essentially a seniority thing. So all the co-op members get shares of the profits that they make, but for every year of longevity that you have at the institution, your share is upped. You know, so if you've been there 5 years, you get a lot higher share than somebody who's just in the first year. And they call that capital of labor, like you build your capital, personal capital, by working there for the duration. Huh? Solely on the duration. Solely on duration. So the seniority. And there are some, the co-ops aren't quite free to do anything they want with their profits. 50% has to be distributed among members, but they decide how. And the other 50% is supposed to go for investment in the co-op and in social purposes within the co-op, etc. So there's a 50-50 split of the profits between incomes for the members and social purposes, essentially. That's by law. That's not up to the cooperative, you know, to decide on that division. But even with the 50% of the profits, they are able to pay higher salaries than ordinary urban agricultural work. Of course, they are not called salaries, I guess. They are profits, utilidades, or whatever. But, so it's a, and that second in command in urban agriculture, Compagnoni, is dead set on that. Says you've got to give people economic reasons for wanting to do this, you know, like, so the economic incentives always have to be there, in his opinion. So that's one of the areas in which there could be problems in the future, because I think one reason why the urban agricultural wages are, or incomes are so high is because people spend all their money there now, because they don't have to spend it in healthcare and education, blah, blah. Well, what happens if Cuba becomes more like a society where that doesn't happen? You know, you have to start paying for your education and healthcare and transportation and utilities and housing and all this stuff. Well, that's going to take some money away from being able to spend on urban agriculture, obviously, you know, on buying lettuce. And then their incomes may suffer, I suspect, you know. But right now they find themselves in a sweet spot, I guess, of income production. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you for your answer.